Thank you, David. Okay, let's get started. We're going to talk about calibration for all your display devices. That includes your laptop, your desktop, iPhones, iPads, projectors, all those cool devices that you use to show your work to others, teach, make presentations, that sort of thing. Just want to point out the image that you're seeing on the screen was taken in a very unusual place. It's called Mono Lake. It's a mineral lake in the eastern side of the Sierra Mountains up near Bishop, California. And it's got a long history, but I just thought I would share that information with you. Okay, let's see here. There we go. So in the past, I think most of us have memories of struggling with calibrating just one device, a computer display. And it's always been a little bit problematic up until just a few years ago. So many different types of displays, so many choices among display calibration devices. And it was even more difficult to unite all the display devices to give consistent color performance. And as the number of these devices has continued to increase, we have iPhones, iPads, tablets, different styles of laptops, the Retina display, all-in-one computers like the iMac. It becomes more and more challenging. But now you can greatly improve accuracy and consistency across the board. The Spyderproof series of calibration devices are very versatile, very flexible, can handle most anything that you might want to use in terms of photographic presentation or image editing. Some of the things that we can address with these devices include color profiling, color balance, efficiency in post-production, and more. Now I put these three images up just as an illustration of what can happen. Each one of these is remarkably different. The one on the lower right is the one that's most correct. Of course, depending on how well color managed your screen is, you should see a very, very nice aspen tree on a hillside. This was taken up near Lundy Lake in the eastern Sierras. And then I altered the other two images going from top left to center. The image on the top left has a number of color casts in it, most noticeable being a magenta or purple color cast. And it's interesting that if you had this on your screen and you sat and looked at it for a while, the eye and brain are so marvelously adaptable that it would start to look normal to you, that the tree trunks would look gray like they do in the lower right, and a lot of the other colors would fall into line. The eye does adapt. The problem comes is when you want to output this image or share it with others, that it doesn't really hold up. And the image in the middle is a typical example of a screen that's too bright. And a lot of people say to me, well, my prints don't match my screen. And the first question I ask them is the print too dark? And I would say 7 out of 10 people say yes. And that's usually an indicator that the screen is too bright and they're editing to a bright image, and therefore the screen image is going to be brighter than the printed image. So you can see here that there's not a huge amount of variance between these, but enough to be noticeable and certainly enough to be problematic. And we're going to talk about how you can get control of that. Now, the first thing I want to do before we continue is to ask you to please respond to this quick poll and help me understand what types of displays that you're actually using for most of your image editing. So we'll just pause here for a moment. Okay, so here we are with the results. 19% are using a laptop, about 35% are using a single desktop display, about 31% are using a dual display, and about 14% are using a built-in display, like an iMac or an HP PC, that sort of thing. Well, that's very interesting. A single desktop display is the most frequently used. And I'm kind of surprised that there's that many people using dual desktop displays. I congratulate you. It's a great way to go when you're doing Photoshop or Lightroom. You can really spread out and be efficient. Let's talk a little bit about display and device calibration. The photo here illustrates shooting tethered in a studio. And before I get started, I want to point something out about this. Again, we were talking before about eye-brain adaptation to color environment. And there's a flaw in this photograph. And that's why I included it, actually. Look at all the colors behind the display, the monitor. Those are backgrounds. Those are rolls of paper or rolls of fabric. And they're in a color family. They're typically, tan. Some of them you might call skin tones. There's just a couple that are black and white or gray. And believe it or not, in an environment like that, your eye is going to be influenced by the color that's behind the screen, and it's going to push your color perception in directions that you don't want to go. You really want to be in an environment where the screen is the brightest thing in the room and the colors behind the screen, the colors around you, the colors reflecting off of things in the room are neutral. Now, moving on to display and device calibration. Each display or device has its own color fingerprint. In a sense, each display, even if they're the same model from the same manufacturer, can be slightly different. And displays change over time. And both of those reasons alone are good reasons to calibrate your display. Displays change because the backlight changes in large part. Wide gamut displays, frequently out of the box, the manufacturers set them up to give you the wow factor, and they're oversaturated, they're high contrast. If you want an example of something similar, walk into an electronics store and look at the televisions on the wall, and you'll see the most amazing range of distorted imagery imaginable. Another reason to do your display and device calibration is to protect your highlight and shadow detail. Again, a lot of these devices come out of the box. They're set up to be very, very bright, 2 to 3 times what you need for photography. And that's really going to distort your shadow detail. It's going to not give you a very good black point, and you're going to see things in the shadow that you probably won't see in your print. And as you saw before in the picture of the Aspens, the highlights, if the screen is too bright, those highlights are not going to be visible. The highlight details are going to go away. And you're going to discover that you have details in those areas when you print or you go to another display device that are beautiful, that you really want to preserve. In the midtones and midtone transitions, shadow transitions in a portrait, midtone transitions in areas that are side lit, for example, are much better on a calibrated display. Let's talk about a match to ambient light conditions. I do have a couple of opinions about this that are a little bit different than what you might see from other people. The first thing is that, yes, it's very nice to have a calibration device that will adapt your screen brightness to ambient light conditions. But at the end of the day, there's limits to that. And what you really want to do is control your lighting so that the screen is the brightest thing in the room. And it's not helpful to have a very bright room and then adapt the screen to an overly bright environment, and all of a sudden you're back in that trap of losing highlight and shadow detail and colors and contrast that's not right anymore. So you do want to control your ambient light conditions, and then if you want to adapt within those limits, that's just fine. And we already talked about backgrounds. I was just at a meeting in Toronto. It's the Henry's Exposure Photo Expo, and it's a big show. A lot of people there asking me questions about color management and color calibration. And they asked me, once it's calibrated, how do I know if the colors are correct? And I think the answer is memory colors is the phrase that we like to use. Memory colors are, does the sky really look blue? Does the grass look green? Are the colors that you normally see present in the image on screen, are they pleasing? Are they correct as far as you're concerned? Not so much that you've adapted to a bad environment, but that they look true to life. Now, talking about workflow, color calibration, screen calibration, or device calibration facilitates or enables a lot of different paths or workflows, workflow elements. You have to be interested in screen to print match, whether you're sending your work out to a lab, a print service provider. Some people even take it down the street to places like Costco. Whether you're printing it yourself, you're shooting tethered, it's important to have a calibrated screen so you can see what you're getting as you're shooting. Sharing your work, some people are in work groups. Some people are sharing their work with others over the internet or via email, etc., etc. You're going to be doing, in many cases, portfolio or field reviews. Those can be with potential clients, a very important aspect of this. And you can be making presentations to customers or potential clients. And that particularly holds true for those of us who are doing portrait and wedding photography. Now, in display calibration, excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water very quickly. Thank you. In display calibration, I think one of the things that people can talk about hardware all day long, but if the software is difficult to use, then you're in a situation where it's all uphill. You're pretty likely not to use the product. And I'm pleased to say that the Spyder 4 software screens are extremely user-friendly and self-explanatory. And I'm going to show you a few examples and talk you through the basics here to give you an idea of what that's really like, what the experience is like. You install the software and connect the Spyder 4 device via your USB port. And of course, like most software packages today, it's going to ask you for serial number. And then the screens will come up and the wizard will ask you to choose your display type. And you can see here for the Spyder 4 Elite, we have an LCD. And for the dinosaurs like me among us, still familiar with CRTs, although I don't own one anymore. Laptops and projectors are, it's possible to calibrate all these devices with the Spyder 4 Elite. And then the next screen, I think, is very, very helpful. It asks you to warm up your screen, and I would say that typically you want to have the screen running for about a half an hour before you go ahead and calibrate it. You want to have your lighting conditions under control. You want to have your display controls set correctly, and you want to make sure that your Spyder is connected correctly. And then here's one of the main control screens, and this is really quite interesting. People ask me, how long does it take to complete a calibration? The answer is not very long. And here are three options in screen calibration: recalibrate, check your calibration, or full calibration. Let's start with full calibration. Full calibration doesn't take very long, 10 minutes, maybe a little longer. There is a utility in the Spyder 4 Elite which is called iterative gray balance, which adds a module onto the full cal, which adds a few minutes to it. But again, it's not the kind of thing that I find to be intrusive. And then in subsequent calibrations, you can check it and see how it's holding up, or you can recalibrate it, which takes much less time than a full cal. Neither one really is a burden. Down below, you have drop-down menus with options for gamma, white point, and brightness. And the ones that you see here on your screen are the ones that are the defaults, the recommended settings. And that's gamma 2.2, a white point of 6500K, and a brightness of about 120. And of these, I think the one that generates the most questions is the brightness setting of 120. That's compared to the brightness that you're going to see when you take these displays or other devices out of the box is relatively low. But the reason is, and I'm sort of repeating myself, the reason is in large part that you're protecting your shadow and highlight detail. You're working towards a good screen to print match. When you get much above 120, you're going to start blowing away the highlights and you're going to distort the shadows. And your midtones are going to start to look a little funny along the way. I typically run my screen under 120, but I have a very dark workroom, and so that works for me. But in most people's homes and studios, 120 will get the job done. Now, the software even puts an outline on your screen to show you where the Spyder goes. It typically goes right in the center. And there's a little counterweight on the back. I suggest that when you're doing this, that you, if you can do this, tilt your desktop display or other computer back a few degrees so that the Spyder lays flat on the screen. You don't want any bright light shining directly on the screen, like sunlight through an open window would probably be a bad idea for obvious reasons. And the software is going to run through projecting, for lack of a better word, a series of color patches on screen. And the 7 sensors inside the Spyder 4 are going to read those color patches. And it goes through a measurement cycle, and it compares the known value of the patches that it wants to display with what it's actually seeing. And it's going to basically calculate the difference between them, and it's going to generate and save those results. It produces a translation, if you will, from the incorrect values that were shown by the display, and they're always going to be off, even if in only small degree, to the standardized values that you need to see for accurate presentation and accurate work in your image editing. And the Spyder 4 is the most accurate in the Datacolor line yet. It's about 25–26% more accurate than the Spyder 3. It can handle the modern wide gamut displays and the new laptops, the iPad, the iPhone, and projectors. And you can see on the right, and I did this in kind of a dramatic way to make the point. You can see that the patches on the top, which are pretty far off, have now been brought into line in the bottom of the screen to facilitate your work. Now, one of the things that the Spyder 4, I'm just going to be very brief about this, show you this screen, is that it can analyze the ambient light and give you a recommendation for the brightness. And I deliberately did this in a very dark room to show you just how low this thing actually could go. And 90 candelas per square meter is going to give you a screen that will take you about a week to get used to. So that room that we were measuring in was probably a little bit too dark. And so, you know, what I would recommend is if you have a window, is to cover it so that the outside light has minimal impact, and have perhaps one small lamp in the corner of the room behind you so you can move around the room without stumbling and things like that, and see things on your desk but not have a significant impact on your perception of the screen. And this is just a reminder, it's a little tip for calibration. This is the kind of window you don't want to have in your workspace. It's a beautiful view. I could sit there all day and look out this window and be a happy camper. It's a beautiful place. But the fact is that bright light coming in the window with all the blues and greens and daylight and things like that are going to push your color vision around to the point where it's going to make it harder for you to accurately edit your images. It's going to affect your color vision. It's going to create fatigue because it's competing with the brightness of the screen. Remember, the screen should be the brightest thing in the room. So if you get the urge to fling back the blinds and let all that glorious daylight in while you're image editing, just think of this photograph and think of what it's going to do to your color vision. Now we have another poll. I'd like to know how long ago you purchased your display. Was it less than a year, 1 to 2 years, or 2 to 3 years, or more than 3 years ago? And we'll pause here for the answers. Well, that's interesting. Almost 20% purchased within a year, and 33% within 1 to 2 years. And then we've got people at 27% 2 to 3 years, and more than 3 years ago, 21%. And I'd like to suggest a few things based on these results. If it's been less than 1 year, in many cases, the monitor that you purchased is going to have a wider color gamut than ones that you could have gotten 2 years ago or 3 years ago. It all depends on the model. And you want to be aware that you need very capable monitor calibration device to handle those wide gamut monitors. And if your monitor is more than 3 years old, please do look at it and carefully evaluate its performance. As you get past the 3-year point, the backlight on these devices starts to fade a little bit, and you may be in a position where the color is less than optimal, and of course the contrast and the other issues start to raise their heads. And one thing that comes with the Spyder 4, particularly the Elite, is a series of reports and analyses that show you the performance of your display. And I find there's some that I find to be more interesting than others. This is certainly one of my favorites. If you look at this, the sort of teardrop shape with all the colors in it is a graph. It's a 2D graph of human vision. It shows you the range of colors that we can see. And in purple, it shows you Adobe 98, which is the color space that's used by a lot of wide gamut monitors. Now, the calibrated display, the display that I calibrated when I was putting this particular screenshot together, achieves a color space bigger than Adobe 98. I'm very lucky to have that, and it's very useful in image editing. Having said that, most printers right now and printer manufacturers are working towards the Adobe 98 color space. Some of them aren't there yet. Some are approaching it. And so Adobe 98 is a nice benchmark at the present time. If you're thinking about getting a new display, that's something to think about. I also want to make a point that laptops, as far as I know, I haven't yet seen a laptop that delivers more than an sRGB, which is a significantly smaller color space than Adobe 98. I'm sure there's one or two out there. I just haven't seen them. Most of the ones that you see are running at a smaller color gamut than your desktop display that's running at Adobe 98. So just a thing to remember when you're doing color editing on a laptop. Now, there's also a utility called Spyderproof, and this is a very versatile tool, a little bit deceptive at first glance in the sense that there's things under the surface here, tools under the surface that you can use that are very useful. So I've put the before screen in front, and you can see that this is looking pretty flat, low contrast, low saturation, etc., etc. And then if you look towards the back, you can see that the corrected, calibrated view is much more vibrant. It's got good contrast. The dimensionality is significantly better, which is really nice to see. Also, these are divided, if you look carefully, into 4 groups. There's different types of images, and if you follow the cursor on my screen, I'll show you what they are. Here's the first group, 4 images together. The second group consisting of portraits. The third group consisting of black and white images, and the fourth group consisting of scenics and landscapes and architecture. Now, if you double-click in the center of any of these groups, it will enlarge to fill this space right here. I'm showing you with my cursor so that only 4 images are shown. So you can flip back and forth between a calibrated and uncalibrated view just for one group of images, for example, the black and whites or the scenics and landscapes. And again, if you click on one of those images, that will expand to fill the screen so you can look at one scene or person or still life and get an idea of how they compare before and after. And if you happen to own a Spyder checker, here's a photograph of the Spyder checker for you to compare. Now, when I was in Toronto, and of course at other meetings, I got asked a number of questions about what happens if I have a laptop and a desktop, or I have 2 desktop displays, and they're made by different manufacturers, and one's older than the other, and even when I calibrate them, they're off just a little bit. Well, here's the answer, which is SpyderTune. And I would suggest that less is more, but you can move these sliders and bring one monitor into line with the other. And so your displays can be much better matched. in challenging circumstances. It also is very useful, for example, in a work group where you have several machines in an office, and it just takes a moment to give it a little tweak to get it back to where it needs to be. Now, I know this is an eye test. I apologize. These are some of the advanced tests that are available in the Elite software package. And I call this, for lack of a better phrase, a heat map, but what this particular one is showing you is color uniformity for brightness. And if you look at this, you see in the center, these numbers are the variance calculated by the software. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner, that 4.3 value, that deep orange running towards red, is problematic. This is a display that's definitely got issues. I don't often see this. It's usually in the range of 1 to 1.5 on the periphery, and you can see that here. That 2.6 is probably getting pretty close to being unacceptable. Generally, you want delta E to be 3 or under. Okay, but the idea is that the sweet spot on most monitors is right in the center, and it sort of works in concentric circles and gets progressively a little bit less accurate as it goes towards the corners, both in terms of brightness and color. So if you're working on a critical area, here's a little tip for you. Zoom in on it and work on it in the center. You'll probably be happier with what happens. As David Tobie likes to point out, this is one of my favorite tests, and if the last one wasn't an eye test, this one certainly is. And I want to point out that there's a lot of numbers here and a lot of things to look at, and these are evaluations of how the display does with different colors that were tested during calibration. And I don't think it's particularly useful to look at individual colors, but what I am interested in particular, is the average. For this screen, it's 1.8, which is pretty decent. Any screen that's at under 3 is pretty decent. And the maximum was 3.27, so there was one color or two colors here that were close to the limit, and the minimum is 0.13. Just as a point of reference, my HP Dreamcolor display calibrates to about 0.75, 78, something like that. It gives you an idea, but really anything under 3 is not discernible by the human eye. But this is a very useful test, and you can keep track of this over time and see how your average does as your display gets older. I also like this particular Spyder graph. It's kind of cute in a way. You take the results of all the different tests, and they're given a numeric score, and you can see that luminance uniformity is the weak point for the display in question. And of course, you can compare this to other displays if you wish. Now, once you've got it calibrated, what do you do with it? What do you do with it? It's the most common thing is that people are looking for screen to print match. Can you match your print to your screen? And interestingly, people come to me and ask that question. I believe I mentioned this before, but it's worth saying again. They come to me and they say, my prints are too dark. And I say, is there anything else wrong with the color? And they go, no, not really. And what that usually indicates is that the screen is running hot. It's running too bright. So they're probably also having issues with, related to luminance, including dynamic range, black point, white point, shadow, highlight, detail, those kinds of things. When the color is truly off, you're going to be seeing things that the white balance and individual color rendering are off. And when you calibrate them correctly on a well-built display, all of those things go away. And it's also a big advantage in image editing. And I mentioned a moment ago soft proofing and color preview. Well, soft proofing and color preview is a way of simulating the appearance of your image as it's produced by the output device. And in this case, we've been talking about the printer, your screen-to-print match. In other words, when you enable soft proofing, which is kind of an archaic term, I realize that it doesn't really tell you what it's really doing. I like to call it color preview. When you enable soft proofing, the screen is going to emulate the output device. It's going to show you what's going to happen when you make that print or you go to the other output device. And that means that while you're editing in real time, you can see what the impact is going to be on the end product. And I can't emphasize too much how important that is. I don't want to be editing an image and spend an hour or two on it and get to the end and find out that I've made a print and I have to go back and tweak it. That print tweak cycle is, in my view, pretty wasteful and destructive. That print tweak cycle, that vicious loop, wastes time and money. You make a print, you come back and you tweak it. You make a print, you come back and you tweak it. And pretty soon an 8x10 that should have cost you $1.30 is now up to $10 or $20. Who needs that? If you calibrate the display, it's going to save you time and money. So here's how soft proofing works in Photoshop. It's pretty straightforward. The nomenclature is a little bit archaic, but the use of it is pretty straightforward. You go to the main menu in Photoshop, just as an example, you go View to Proof Setup, and you go to Custom, okay? And there's going to be a panel here that has a drop-down, and the most important thing on here is Device to Simulate. And all of the paper profiles that you've loaded into your computer, and these are typically installed when you install the printer. The manufacturers include these paper profiles as part of the installation. You will see that these are available to you and you can use them for your soft proofing or your color preview. I've got a lot of them, I admit. So the one on the lower right is the preview for plain paper, and you can see that it's definitely a B, if not a C or a D. It's got problems with contrast and color, etc., etc., etc. And it's, it's an issue in the sense that that's not what you would want to have produced on your printer. So you can see in this preview that things are not not good for you as a photographer. In A, I set that to Epson Premium Luster, and it pops. It's got great color in the flowers. You've got great detail in the highlight areas. The greens look green. The blues look blue. It passes all those tests. And so you know that when you're editing, you're working in the right direction. Now, you can profile while you're printing. This is from CS6, but CS5 is very similar. It's just that CS5 is set up with 3 vertical divisions on this panel instead of 2. All you have to do is click down here on the Match Print Colors, and in color handling, you would change it to Photoshop Manages Colors, and you would, again, select that printer profile. At that point, you're going to see a color-accurate preview of the image as it's going to come from the printer. It's kind of your last chance before you pull the trigger and actually make the print. I forgot what I was going to say. What was that? It's your last chance to see the print before you actually, make it and spend time and money on the paper. In Adobe Lightroom 4, in the Develop module, it's very easy to enable soft proofing. If you go to the lower left in this panel, you'll see that there's soft proofing with a checkbox. You just check that off and soft proofing will be enabled, or you can press the S key as a keyboard shortcut. Then you would come up here to Proof Settings, watch where my cursor goes, and you would go to Profile, and you would pick the profile that you want to use for your preview. This is what it looks like. If you go to this area, you will see that all those same profiles are going to pop up, and you can include these in a short list here, so you don't have to parse through this whole long list every time you do this, which makes life a little bit easier. Now I'm going to move on to, we've got a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to move on to calibrating your Spyder Gallery for iPad and iPhone. It's a one-of-a-kind solution. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It's designed to help photographers manage color output on their iPad or their iPhone display. And it corrects that quote, unique color palette of the iPad and the iPhone. And it facilitates the use of these devices in presentation and portfolio tools. I use my iPad almost every day to show people my work. I really feel like it's an indispensable tool. The impact that it has on the customers, I think, is significantly more than a printed portfolio right now, because they're still new enough that you have a novelty effect. A device that emits light and shows your images is kind of like putting big chromes, transparencies on a light table, is very nice. And so I actually prefer to do that rather than showing my printed portfolio right now. Okay, I'm trying to advance to the next page. One would install the software on both the iPad and your desktop. I won't get into the details of that and bore you, but it's very, very straightforward. And you connect the Spyder Color to your computer and click the OK button. And what's going to happen is the software wants to see both devices on your local network. So you have to have a wireless network running locally. It's going to ask you to select that network, and that's the way that the computer talks to the iPad and the iPad talks to the computer. So the Spyder is plugged into the USB port. It's reading what happens on the iPad. The iPad runs through the color patches. The two devices communicate, the three devices communicate with each other either via wireless or USB, and voila, you're calibrated. You place the colorimeter on the screen, you click OK, and it does the rest. Now, this is obviously not going to appear on your iPad. This was put together to help you understand what the impact could be. If you look at the uncalibrated side, it's typical performance for an uncalibrated display or output device. It's a little flat. It's a little undersaturated. Some of the details aren't really what they should be. If you look at the model's eyes, for example, you can't see all the details. In fact, some of the eyelashes don't show up as well as they do on the image on the right. The black point on the left is definitely weak. If you go to the calibrated side, you can see the black point is very strong. You've got good saturated colors in the flowers. Skin tones are great. In fact, the skin texture looks better to me. The hair textures are better. The eyes are just beautiful. They're luminous. They have depth. The eyelashes and eyebrows look natural and beautiful. It's just a better presentation of your work. And I can't say this enough. You only get one chance to make a first impression. Now we're going to move on to projectors. I would guess that any of us that have tried to use projectors, particularly ones that don't belong to us in a public venue and things like that, have been frustrated. The process of calibrating these is similar to display calibration. It's not particularly difficult. It's very important for showcasing your work. A lot of wedding photographers use these for showing their portfolio to potential customers, upselling customers to bigger prints, using them in exhibition displays, teaching and discussions, etc., etc. It's easy to use in studio or on location, and it's not dependent on the color or the age of the screen that you're projecting to, which is important. Color is an important part of your message when you're working with a projector, and it's a very important part of your credibility. You don't have to make excuses like, don't worry, I'll fix the color. For example, in your print or in the work that I'm going to deliver to you, each presentation will show your work properly. I don't think anybody wants to make excuses to a customer or a potential client when they're doing some work of this type. Now, here's a few tips, a brief projector review. Match your projector to the requirements. You've got to think about size. Is it portable or not? Output in terms of brightness, what type of projector it is, and I'll get that to that in a minute. Contrast and color accuracy, resolution, wireless connector type, all those things have to be lined up for you to be able to use it effectively. Let's talk a little bit about LCD projectors. They're different than their counterparts, which are the DLP projectors. They generally give richer color saturation, particularly in rooms with significant ambient light levels. They use less power and they create less heat, but they have a larger footprint, generally speaking. And the black point is less intense than DLP projectors. They also tend to be, if memory serves me, I haven't purchased one in a while, I think they tend to be a little bit less expensive. The DLP projectors, the pixels are less visible. They generate blacker blacks and in generally higher contrast. On the other hand, the trade-off is that they generally have poor reds and yellows at full power. And that's something to think about. The color saturation often suffers, but they're more portable and they have a smaller footprint and they weigh less. So you can look at these two types, and you know, it's not necessarily even that you might want to go out and buy one tomorrow, but when you walk into a room where you're going to present, you might want to take a look at the projector and know what you're dealing with before you start your work. And that's a very, very useful thing to do. Now, the Spyder 4 does much of the same work when it's calibrating your screen. It's a good idea to keep the ambient light levels low when you're doing this. And this is a drawing, but it does get the idea across. You can mount the Spyder. It has a little cradle that has a tripod mount. You can light it on a tripod or on a light stand with the right stud at the top. And you place it about 12 inches from the screen. And you back up and you put your projector on the table and line it up properly. And you start the software. And it's going to project onto the screen, and the 7-sensor eye of the Spyder is going to read the colors that are projected on the screen and do much of the same work that it does when it's calibrating your desktop display. Now, I'm sure that some of us have had experiences in the past where we've tried to calibrate a projector, particularly one that doesn't belong to us. I certainly have, and I've used other devices and tried to calibrate those projectors, and I found that it was very fiddly and time-consuming and not particularly effective. And I find the Spyder is very easy to use. It runs smoothly, and it does a great job, and I can prove it. I have an older DLP projector. I got it because it was small for travel, and I had actually never been able to calibrate that device until I got the Spyder 4, and with the Spyder 4 it calibrates beautifully. So a device that I thought I was going to have to replace at significant expense is now again useful to me, and that's a pretty cool thing. I like that. The one thing I would suggest is, if you want to give yourself some room, is get yourself a USB extension cable. If the physical circumstances require it, you can back up a little bit from the screen and the Spyder and give yourself a little bit of room to maneuver while you're doing this activity. So we're getting pretty close to the finish line. It's almost 10 to the hour. And I want to point out, you know, at the finish, this is a picture that was taken in Yosemite last fall, by the way. It's on one of the roads approaching the valley. It's underneath a bridge, actually. This image has a lot of things going for it. The grays are gray. The gray stones and the tree trunks look, you know, the memory serves well here, and they look natural to me. The greens are green. The yellows are yellow. It has a good black point. If this is printed, by the way, there is pretty decent detail in the shadows underneath this rock and over here in this corner and down here along the bottom. And so I was able to preserve those. And while I was editing this, I was working very hard to preserve the highlight detail in some of these yellow leaves here and the orange leaves on the left. They're really quite bright. The sun was trying to break through. And so I'm proud to say that I won a couple of awards with this print, but a big part of that success was having a display that was calibrated correctly and being able to edit to the correct endpoint. And that really has served me well over time. So a color managed workflow gives you consistent color throughout from beginning to end, and helps you make sure your images sparkle from start to finish. It starts with the camera and getting it right in the camera, and I can't emphasize enough that correct exposure is one of the major keys to success in getting the color that you want and making sure that your color workflow is correct. And your display technology has to serve you well. Your display is your window into the world of your computer. It's the one thing that governs how well you can do with the devices that you own or use. And getting that display right is going to make everything else easier, whether you're going to print or electronic signage, or you're going to you're making images for a book. Whatever it is, that display is your friend, and treating it right and getting it under, getting it to do your bidding is really going to help you in your work. Now, our winner is Sandra Maxwell. We'll email you, Sandra, with and ask you privately for your shipping info. I want to point out that there's a special offer from the 16th of October through the 23rd. There's a discount of 20% on all Spyder purchases made at Datacolor.com website. Your discount code is display20. That's display20. I encourage you, those of you who are going to be in New York, the Photo Plus Expo is next week. We'll be at Exhibit 1239. I'll be there, and so will David Tobie. Please do come by and say hello. We'd love to see you, answer your questions, help you with whatever issues you're dealing with. Again, that's Exhibit 1239, October 25th through 27th, next week in New York. It will be at the Javits Center. I want to thank Datacolor for their sponsorship of this webinar. They've been really great about this. We've done quite a few webinars this year. We're going to continue to do them throughout the end of this year. Take a look at the website, www.datacolor.com. My blog, which has quite a few technical articles and tips and tricks and things like that, is davidsaffir.wordpress.com. And one thing I do for my students is I will answer emails. If you have a question or a concern, email me at dsaffir@mac.com. I do get a lot of emails, particularly after I get back from a show like the one in Toronto. If you don't get an answer in 24 hours, email me again. It just means that I missed you, and I will do my best to answer you. David Tobie also has an excellent blog, highly thought of, cdtobie.wordpress.com. Take a look at his website. There's a lot of good, his blog, there's a lot of good information there. I want to thank you all for attending. We'll be sending you a follow-up email announcing upcoming webinars. Have a great week, and thanks for your attention.
Well, thank you.